There are some ships that are labeled unlucky for various reasons, from unfortunate sinkings to repeated run-ins with the shoreline. Today's video will look at a ship that can be considered unlucky, or alternatively, a victim of hubris. That ship is USS Milwaukee of the St. Louis-class protected cruisers, not the similarly unfortunate USS Milwaukee of the Omaha-class cruisers. The story of this earlier Milwaukee is a short one. Her service life lasted only a handful of active years, and even that was largely in reserve duty. This will, as such, be a short video, one largely focused on her unfortunate fate, more than on her service. Let's get into it. Milwaukee's life began in San Francisco, laid down on July 30th, 1902. She would then launch on September 10th, 1904, with a roughly 2-year fitting out period following, seeing her commissioned into the fleet on December 10th, 1906. All fairly typical as these things go. A less typical thing is her design. I won't go into great detail here, as I reserve that for the name ship. However, the design of these cruisers is weird enough to require mentioning. First and foremost, while I call the ships protected cruisers, that is not entirely accurate. A protected cruiser is a ship with no armor belt, instead relying on an armored deck for protection. USS Olympia, in spite of her heavy firepower, is a good example of this. The St. Louis class, while considered protected cruisers in intended role, do not fit that bill. They do in fact have an armor belt. It was an admittedly thin belt in comparison to contemporary armored cruisers at about 4 inches. However, it is still there, so you will sometimes see these ships referred to as armored cruisers or even semi-armored cruisers. Armor protection aside, the other weird part about these ships is their weapon layout. Putting a wide array of different gun calibers aboard a ship was a normal thing at the time. The same went for casement-mounted guns for both secondary and primary batteries, depending on the type of ship. In the case of the St. Louis design, however, they carried no fewer than 14 6-inch guns, a single gun mounted on the bow, and a single gun on the stern. The remaining 12 guns were split, 6 to a side, in hull-mounted casements. This gave the ships a weapon layout that evokes the old Age of Sail broadside in a lot of ways. Anyone who's used this ship in World of Warships can speak to how that looks, at least in the game world. But again, the details of this design and the mismanaged process that created it can wait. For now, back to Milwaukee herself. She undertook her sea trials in early 1907, working out her capabilities and anything that needed refit. The trials identified a top speed of around 22 knots on 21,000 indicated horsepower through 2 shafts. This would be a good speed for a battleship of the time, but was quickly becoming the slower end of cruiser speeds. Luckily for Milwaukee, she would never have to put that speed to the test in combat. The cruiser finished her trials process and entered regular service in mid-1907, whereupon she was immediately sent off to protect American interests in Central America. This consisted of sailing on the coast of San Salvador and Costa Rica, along with target practice to train her crew. This is really nothing special for the time. What's more telling for Milwaukee is that technology was rapidly leaving her behind. By April of 1908, only a year after joining the fleet, she was already put in reserve in Bremerton. And a short summer cruise in 1908 aside, Milwaukee would remain in reserve until May of 1910. A little under a year of proper service, and then reserve for 2 years. This would already be a bad sign in regard to how the Navy valued her. A brand new ship, almost immediately put into reserve for years. However, it gets worse. Milwaukee was decommissioned in May 1910, not put into service. The cruiser wouldn't be recommissioned until June of 1913, and even then it was for duty with the Pacific Reserve Fleet. This reserve duty saw some short cruises up and down the California coast. The furthest afield that Milwaukee went was Hawaii in July of 1914. Otherwise, she hung close to California and did mostly training cruises. It wouldn't be until 1916 that her role changed again, to a fleet tender for destroyers and submarines in March of that year. The weird cruiser was now a tender for smaller craft. Ouch. That duty saw her continue exercises and training missions, with a break here and there. Among other things, survey duty, patrolling the Mexican coast, and transporting refugees. Nothing major or impressive to add to her resume. That is, until early 1917. On January 5, 1917, Milwaukee was roped into salvage operations by the Navy. While that full story is worth a video of its own, the Cliff Notes version can go here. A submarine, H-3, had run aground in Humboldt Bay in December 1916. Attempts to pull her off the beach failed, which prompted the Navy to send out a bid to commercial salvagers. With a quoted cost of $150,000, the Navy went, nope, too expensive. For context, that's something like $3,582,000 in 2023 money. Thus, you see Milwaukee called in. This in spite of the Navy lacking real salvage experience of this nature or specialized equipment. I'm sure you can guess where this is going. Milwaukee arrived on January 12, 1917, with salvage operations underway by that evening. Things didn't take long to go wrong as the night progressed. One of the restraining lines to keep Milwaukee from running aground broke in the fog and darkness. This had been tied to the monitor Cheyenne, and when it snapped, the current quickly caught Milwaukee. To the Navy's credit, the tug Iroquois, which had previously helped Cheyenne to try and pull H-3 off the beach, tried to help Milwaukee. Unfortunately, the current was so strong that the tug had to cut her own line free, or she would have been pulled aground as well. The resulting mayhem saw Milwaukee's crew scramble to cut the cable, tying them to H-3. Made of heavy steel, it was too strong for their hacksaws. Stuck with the line to the submarine, Milwaukee was gradually pulled towards shore. Even her 21,000 horsepower engines couldn't counteract the power of the Pacific Current. By the early morning of January 13th, specifically around 4 a.m., Milwaukee was beached as well. Not even her anchors had been able to stop her, although they had been dropped in a vain attempt to try. This was bad enough, but the powerful waves continued to pound the cruiser. They damaged her hull, letting water into her machinery spaces. This extinguished her boilers and actually dismounted some of that machinery itself. By this point, the cruiser was probably a write-off, and at real risk of breaking entirely. Understandably, the crew needed to get off the ship. With a large crowd of curious locals watching, a line was rigged to carry them ashore. As this was incredibly dangerous, and dunked them in more often than not, other efforts were necessary. Some of the locals volunteered at this point and took surf boats out to the cruiser. By the evening of the 13th, the crew was off their ship with no lives lost, and relatively few injuries as well, making this rescue operation a success in a string of failures. Milwaukee, meanwhile, was left there to rot. Attempts to salvage her failed, so the Navy eventually resigned itself to just pulling off valuable equipment instead. H-3, meanwhile, was eventually salvaged by a commercial firm after all, and would only be scrapped at the start of the 1930s. The cruiser, on the other hand, broke in two during a storm in November of 1918. While further salvage efforts broke her up more, it was largely nature that destroyed the ship. Enough was left of her in the 1980s for relic hunters to pull parts off for a museum in Eureka, California. Even in 2004, as seen here, parts of the ship were still visible at extreme low tide. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.